Hi, and welcome to this webinar, Handling the Access Control Obstacles from Axiomatics. We're going to look at the new release of the Axiomatics Policy Server today. Before we start our usual guidelines, you are centrally muted, and the webinar is recorded. You can watch it later on. Slides will be available for download, and there will be questions and answers in the end. You have in your chat window the ability to write questions. So my name is Finn Frisch. With me today, I have David Brossard, my colleague, and I'm really happy to have you here, David, because
thank you.
I rarely get to see you these days. You know, I'm worrying because I think David is actually capturing sort of the time, the epicenter of time. He's flying around the globe and with so much energy so that when he lands somewhere, people in that time zone get jet lagged. And I never get to see you. But today you're here, and that's really cool. And the traveling is, to a certain extent, what this is about, because you travel so much and talk to our customers, bring back insights, and some of these insights will present today in this webinar, I think, in an indirect fashion, right?
Absolutely.
Good. So the agenda is this. We'll talk about initially, as fast as possible, go through attribute-based access control for those of you who may be new to the topic. But then we'll talk about the main sort of part will be about how we reduce the divide between business and IT, how we deal with some of the non-technical issues in ABAC deployment projects. Finally, we're going to have a demo where David will run us through the new interface of the Axiomatics Policy Server, and where we also explain how we anticipate that the new release actually helps close some of the problems that our customers had with the deployments.
Right.
Good. So quickly about ABAC, what we see on this image is the main drivers sort of today, or our customers do not have data centers anymore. They have clouds, private clouds, they have mobile users, they have hybrid clouds, tablets, and what have you out there. And in this new landscape, old access control models simply fail.
So, as a matter of fact, it's the increase in the amount of information, the increase in the number of devices, the increase in the number of systems and applications, and the increase in the number of users.
Right. So to determine who should gain access to what is becoming really overwhelming. So we can conclude that existing access control models fail. They are too coarse-grained. They hinder people from collaborating. They lead to productivity and revenue loss. Our existing models are unable to capture risk in a good way. So we have an unnecessary risk exposure. They're unable to meet regulatory requirements. And finally, they are difficult to adapt as things change in the infrastructure.
Right. So the regulations is interesting. I was talking to two customers on my latest trip, and they were talking about the Hong Kong Monetary Authority regulations that stipulate how you're supposed to handle customer data. Mm-hmm. And the existing models, Finn, they're not good enough because depending on the location of the employee of a bank, you may get access or may not get access to clients' data. ABAC here fails.
So that's somewhat as we see it in export control, for instance, and other regulations. It's totally different businesses. Yeah.
It is similar. So the one role dimension is no longer enough.
Right. So we conclude we have to go towards attribute-based access control, more dynamic authorization models. And briefly then, what is attribute-based access control? Well, it is a model where we use policies and rules rather than roles as before, and we use them, we manage them at a central place rather than embedding them into each single application. And these policies that we are using have use attributes to describe exactly who should gain access to what, where, why, when, and how, as opposed to simply managing users in roles to group people together with similar permissions. We further externalize authorization from the application rather than embedding it in the code of the application. And in doing so, we also make it standards-based. So we use the extensible access control markup language. And this is, of course, a huge difference to what we've seen before, where you embed the authorization in the code, C++, Java, C#, whatever your developer is writing. Good. So we claim you need to go ABAC, but even more so, all the authorities on the market sort of say this. On the one hand, we have this Gartner predicts quotation. Many of you who have been in other webinars that we have seen this before. So Gartner predicts that 70% of enterprises will use ABAC as the dominant mechanism to protect critical assets in 2020. We have similar statements from KuppingerCole. Other interesting developments in this respect is, for instance, in how NIST sort of is pressuring more and more with new recommendations and guidelines for a switch to ABAC. So this is really sort of the new normal.
Right. And to just remind listeners of two important dates, 1992, NIST introduces RBAC, role-based access control, and a model on how to use RBAC. 2014, NIST introduces a guide to attribute-based access control, which goes over the technical aspects, but perhaps more importantly, Finn, as you were telling me just before this webinar, the non-technical aspects, the processes that companies have to have in place in order to achieve successful ABAC.
Indeed, yes. A very readable paper. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I take this slide.
Yeah.
All right. So ABAC, if we look at it from an architectural perspective, ABAC, or attribute-based access control, enables externalized authorization. When we say externalized authorization, we mean that we've successfully decoupled the business logic from the authorization logic. And the way we do that is as follows. Imagine that you have here on the left-hand side, top left corner, a user or a client, and that user is trying to access an application, the black box on my picture. That application could be an app, it could be an API, it could be a web service, it could be a database, anything that holds information that you want to get access to. Now, the typical flow is that the user will send a request to that app, and what we will do to enable ABAC authorization is slot in an interceptor, put an interceptor in the flow, and that interceptor on this slide is the traffic light. And the interceptor will be responsible for a couple of different things. First of all, of course, intercepting the business request, hence the name, converting the business request into an authorization request. Here you have an example. Can user Bob access record number 22? Send that off to an external authorization engine. That authorization engine is configured with policies on the one hand. Those standards-based policies define what is allowed and what is not allowed. Here we have permit managers to view the document provided that the document is in draft mode and that the user is in the same region as the document, as an example. You can use, of course, in ABAC, there is no limit to the number of attributes you can use. It can be the region of the user, the sensitivity of the document, so on and so forth. And by the way, that authorization service can refer to external sources of data in order to reach a decision. So if it needs to know more about record number 22, it can go to a LDAP, to a database, to a web service to figure out the missing information. Either way, eventually, the authorization service reaches a conclusion, reaches a decision, either of yes, permit, or no, deny. And that decision is returned to the interceptor, and the interceptor will enforce the decision. In ABAC and in XACML, that interceptor is called a policy enforcement point, and the authorization service is called a policy decision point. If we get a permit, the business flow goes through to the application. If we get a deny, an error will be returned to the user. Finn?
Right. Yes. Thank you, David. And furthermore, these interceptors can be on very many different layers, right, in our infrastructure.
Yeah. So that's something that is extremely cool. The externalized authorization in ABAC enable what I like to call any depth architecture, meaning that you can apply fine-grained authorization to any layer. It's technology neutral. It doesn't matter whether you're dealing with a database, with an enterprise service bus, with an API gateway, or even with your presentation tier. You can have the same consistent authorization across multiple tiers.
Cool. Now, so that was the rapid introduction to attribute-based access control. Now, let's switch to the main topic. We've been doing this from Axiomatics over a number of years, working with large customers all over the world. And we have found that our main interest being very much the technology, not necessarily is what our customers find to be sort of the big challenge. Very often we see the fact that our products become deployed, and that's quick and easy because this is a very, very lightweight technology. It's easily deployable. But then we have a shift that needs to be done within the organization towards the new ABAC model. And that may, from an organizational perspective, from a process perspective, be a bit more of a challenge. So basically the shift we see here on the screen is what we used to do was to group users into roles, assign permissions to that role, and with that sort of we had done our access control homework. In the future, we have a much more fine-grained approach. We can use the attributes that describe the user. Those attributes we already have typically in our HR system and all over in many different information systems. We can use information about the resource, the action, and the environment. All of this put together, this allows us on the one hand to be more fine-grained. It also allows us to use the language of the business rather than some weird functional role names that no one really understands.
It also enables more dynamic authorization versus a more static model, because in ABAC, the permissions are computed at design time when you assign permissions through roles to the users. In ABAC, the decision is made at runtime whenever access is requested, which means that you can take into account more dynamic parameters or attributes such as time of the day, IP of the user, device type. So it enables a more dynamic environment.
Right. So, but if we think about this, it does sort of force you to start thinking in a new way. So as an example, let's look at a typical process that basically exists in every organization, commercial organizations, government organizations, what have you. Purchase to pay. Organizations need to buy things to do their job. This typically contains the steps that we have here to the left. You create purchase orders, you post your purchase orders, and then you have the invoice coming in, and then you have to approve the invoice, and you have to do some payment of it. This picture that we see, we have recreated based on a article that I would like to recommend in the ISACA journal from last year, volume 3. It's by Martin Schulz, who has been looking at the auditing procedures for this type of process. What he suggests in this article, which is really interesting, is that auditors should look more at the IT side of things. If we take a look on the same process and do it through data mining within our systems, then we would get to a view like this. So here we can see how within the ERP system, in his example, actually it is an SAP system, and we can see how the purchase order is created. We post the receipt for when the goods have come in, and that of course leads then to the corresponding transactions within the ERP system. We then process the incoming invoice. So and we add the taxes, and we do the automatic payment on this. Now, when the same process is being reviewed by auditors in the first case from a process perspective, so we have auditors interviewing people in the organization, asking, how do you go about handling this process? They get a view of some kind. When they do this other audit, which may be difficult in many systems, this is not quite possible. So that's what Martin suggests, that we should configure our systems to enable that. But when you do, then all of a sudden you can detect a gap, and that's interesting. For instance, say here we notice that we have invoices to be paid to which we cannot map a purchase order or a receipt. So obviously something is missing there. It may not be a fraud necessarily, but some little piece is missing. Perhaps someone actually bought something without having issued a proper purchase order before. But in that case, we should have some sort of exception handling, what have you. In the example that Martin reviews, there are a number of such instances. instances which the organization probably is not sort of aware of from beforehand. This relates to ABAC to a certain extent, because if we ask the questions, who is authorized to create the purchase order, who is authorized to approve, who is authorized to verify the delivery of the goods, and so on, these questions typically are difficult to answer with this inflexible role model. Obviously, we should have a rule that says do not pay unless we can map an invoice to a purchase order and the receipts. And that's exactly like in the model that you described before, David, what the role is of these attribute resources would be, right?
Right, absolutely. When you use attributes instead of just sticking to roles, you can be more faithful to the original business requirements. You can utilize your business model. So if you have the notion of an invoice, or if you have the notion of a purchase order or a receipt in your example, you can map that out into attributes and use those attributes for your decision making.
Right. And so for the example that we're using here, the objective of the article is actually to describe the new auditing model that is based on data mining. The interesting thing is that if we were in these procedures to use attribute-based access control, I would claim you don't even have to do the changes that the article suggests in order to get the flow into the ERP system. You could use it straight off and get an enormous sort of simplification and more precise sort of authorization. So by getting, mapping these things. So the challenge that we then see among our customers is that you need to switch sort of a mindset. So rather than from like before, finding roles, little buckets of roles where we can put our users into and then hope that the problem will go away, we need to start thinking policy based. We need to start thinking from a business perspective, who should be allowed to create a purchase order? So what are the conditions? Why should anyone be allowed to create a purchase order or approve it? Who should be allowed to approve it? Probably we have limits on the amounts that different people can approve and so on. And all this information exists somewhere, but it's not written down as proper access control policies, right? And if we do, then we could, for instance, in the last approved payment, we could make it a condition that we can map the PO to the receipt and the invoice, sort of to know that that everything sort of has been done properly.
And I'll give you a great example of where ABAC has enabled more dynamic business for one of our retail customers in the United States. They have two types of stores, that retail customer, the bigger stores and the smaller stores. And in the bigger store, they have the notion of two departments, the purchasing department and the sales department. In that case, only those in the purchasing department can buy an item, and only people in the sales department can sell an item. So the segregation of duty between buying and selling is achieved through the department, or to some degree through the role. Now, there are smaller stores that this particular customer has where, unfortunately, because the store is smaller, they don't have the two departments. It means that the employees have got to wear two hats at the same time, two hats, and each hat has a nice little role written on it. So it means you can actually buy and sell at the same time. But of course, you would want to implement a segregation of duty check that you cannot sell what you bought, to avoid the friend relationship. You buy for a lot of money and you sell for a very low amount to your friend. Well, through the use of ABAC, you can actually implement this type of policy, this type of rule with a U, saying that you can buy anything, fine, within limits, and then you can only sell those items you didn't buy in the first place. And that's the relationship that will implement segregation of duty, and that's something that's very easy and very natural to implement in ABAC.
Cool, yeah. And that, I think, will resolve a lot of issues in many organizations struggling with the SOD sort of segregation, especially the small office. Very common, even in very large organizations, that you have these. Yeah, good. So another view on this, this comes from yet another article in the same good paper, this one by Kevin Kobelski, who has suggested a way to help organizations start thinking in the new way of how to authorize. Now, if we look at these situations, the purchase to pay process, or the other one, when we sell, we can conclude that at certain phases within these business processes, a employee is entitled to do things on behalf of the company that represents quite a considerable value. As a salesperson, for instance, I could, when I write my offer to a customer, if I were to put down the price below the real price, my employee will actually sort of miss out on that, and possibly I and the customer could share the difference or something like that. So to avoid fraud in these situations, you have to have further controls. Basically, what Kevin Kobelski suggests is that whenever we see a situation where a staff member has this authority to act on behalf of his employer with valuables, then we need the second stage. We need authorization. We need approval procedures. And this we can look at on very many different levels. We can look at on the level of data input, for instance, the offer, master file changes, which also could radically impact, of course, and represent a risk if I change the address of the recipients of payments or goods or what have you. But also, of course, the programs that show the data on screen for users. So if we do a change that in any way affects this, well, we have to do authorizations by means of testing and so on. Especially, of course, at the very bottom, of course, the procedure of granting authorization. So then, if we think in these terms of authorizing every step, we could start looking at it in this way. So here we have a master data change control policy, for instance. And the two use cases we talked about would be to permit users to make a master data change request. That would be the first policy, sub-policy in here. And the other one would be to approve master data changes. And in both of these instances, we then need, as business managers, we need to sit down and think, all right, what are the conditions under which a user should be allowed to make a master data change request? So when do we deny such a request? And when do we permit it? And on the other hand, for those who are entitled to approve these changes, when are they allowed to approve them? When should they be denied an approval? So by switching in this direction, we can start shifting our mindset into a way of thinking policies rather than roles. So many of these processes that we look at and that for which our customers use ABAC also have the notion of a workflow. So very often we have sort of an added layer of complexity due to the fact that there is a workflow. In this example, we'll have, if we look in the planning phase, there will typically be a situation where the members of, for instance, a project or a product development team, it is in this case actually, the members will be allowed to create, read, update, and delete fairly freely because we're planning and nothing is very important. But when we shift and we go into production, then all of a sudden there is a contract with the customer. This contract is legally binding. There are only a certain amount of things we can do. So then we need to freeze a lot of data. So this shift in the workflow actually changes the access permissions on the data level. And here, of course, ABAC is wonderful. Also, we could have other users that are outside the project who should be allowed to see data under certain circumstances. Now, if we, in this example, and this is sort of going back a bit to customers who use product lifecycle management tools. In product lifecycle management, you very often also have an additional layer of legal constraints, for instance. So here we see here we have sort of the English version of a language of a policy. Everyone can read the public documents, but classified documents can only be read by the project members, and it then differs between the phases of the project. And if we have export control regulations, for instance, like some of our customers, then we get an added layer. So we look again at this. Yep.
So just to jump in very quickly, this document that Finn is now sharing is the sort of document that I use with my customers, and the process is always the same. Identify the use case at a high level. What is it you're trying to do? Build a web portal for medical documents. out of the use case, identify the authorization requirements, which is what you did here on the slide, Finn. Everyone can read project documents of type public info. From there, you're going to derive the building blocks, the attributes that you need, and then you're going to rewrite the authorization requirements with those attributes. And as a matter of fact, when we do the demo of APS 6, we'll go into that process of breaking down the authorization requirements.
Cool. And this policy, if we look at how this could be broken down, what we see here on the screen are actually sort of graphical representations of the building blocks of XACML policies. So to the left, we have a policy set, the green box. The policy set is called access to product documentation in this PLM system, probably. So first of all, then we have a policy at the top that talks about compliance with export control regulations, and these are difficult to deal with. It's where applicable, the company needs to apply a great many categories onto the data that they process to ensure that they don't allow any such data to be transferred into countries that are sort of off limits due to the export control regulation. That's a totally separate topic that has nothing to do with the actual application. Now, the second policy, grant access to assembly listing, has to do with the actual assembly within the system. And there we have the policy about the internal sort of policy logic within our application. And thirdly, then grants access to individual documents. The assembly is sort of a list of documents. And finally, the last one is on the individual level. And on each of these levels, we can see sort of various conditions then for a permit or deny that we can build down like this. Now, the interesting part, if we look at this, we can of course see that we easily get into a situation of a certain complexity where people need to collaborate, and collaboration is key. Because in this instance, first of all, we have the export regulations. These people who write policies about these things do not necessarily know anything about the application or sort of the practical workings of where this applies. They may be legal experts, they may be compliance officers, what have you, and they need to be able to develop their own language and their own policies around this and make sure that they can map the data of the organization to the regulation, right? So our suggestion to establish this collaborative workflow is that we can put all these experts within a certain domain of concerns in one sandbox where they can sort of work on their policies. Then we have the experts in this case, the product lifecycle management product itself with its inner logic. And those experts develop their policies. And thirdly, sort of the document management system or rather the drawing system probably that is below. There we have another sort of set of experts, system owners who need to work on policies. After they've developed these policies in their respective sort of sandboxes, we can mount them together at the central place in Axiomatics Policy Server, distribute them to the authorization domains, like you will show later on, David, right? And this is very much sort of what we hope will aid customers to reduce this threshold that sometimes is felt in the complexities of managing multiple domains of concerns. So lastly, what we've learned from our customers here's one example from the Nordics. This is a customer here in the Nordic region, the financial industries. They've done some very, very simple things to resolve some of the issues they had. They early detected that key for project success is to define policy owners so that these various domains of concerns can be set up so that it's possible to get a procedure for policy lifecycle management. So someone needs to take ownership. The same goes for the attributes. What they did was a very simple little tool where they have the policy owners and the attributes published sort of on the intranet, so that anyone can go and see what policies do we have, who owns them, and why are they there, and where are they in their life cycles. And this helped them very much to sort of, they started with one very small project in one country, right, David?
They did, yes.
And now they've expanded and use attribute-based access control in a great number of applications and in 4 countries, I think.
Correct, across the Nordics.
Across the Nordics, yeah. So and this very simplistic little tool that they had sort of helped them a lot. With this,
you know what? On that, simple is what makes your ABAC successful. It's the simple steps, the simple processes here, identifying the governance around the policies, identifying the governance around the attributes that make your attribute-based access control strategy a success.
Right. And I think with this, we're going to leave this section of the webinar, and we hope that we actually managed to answer the question that we set out to answer. How can we reduce the divide between IT and business somewhat? You'll let us know in the question section, I'm sure, whether we were successful or not in answering that. Now we're going to look into the product, right?
Right. So Axiomatics Policy Server version 6.0 was released a couple weeks ago. About 4 or 5 of our customers have been using it now for the last 2 weeks. And the feedback is extremely positive. The main focus for Axiomatics Policy Server really was to make ABAC even easier to use than it was before. And I believe, based on the feedback we've been getting so far, that we've hit the mark pretty well, Finn. Now, more specifically, there are really 4 new features in the Axiomatics Policy Server version 6.0. First and foremost, the main new feature is a new web-based policy editor. And the screenshots that you had in your slides earlier, Finn, look a lot like the editor. They're very close to the editor. The point of this new web-based editor is to make it easy for the business owners, for the business analysts to write and review the policies. The tool presents the policies in a, I would almost call it geographical view. You can get a very good sense of what the policies do, and provided you could use good descriptions, you can really understand what the policies do and what they prevent, what access they prevent. As a consequence of having web-based policy editing, we've also enabled one-click deployment, which is a great neat little feature. If you write a policy, from the point where you write the policy to the point where you can deploy it in an authorization domain is a matter of a couple clicks. I'll be showing that in the demo. So it means that your deployments, your time to market, will be greatly reduced. The third feature goes to the collaboration aspect you were mentioning, Finn, and that's the enhanced attribute dictionary. Now we've introduced the notion of a namespace. We chose that notion of a namespace for 2 reasons. One, because it is familiar to architects and developers. It's a concept used in many different programming languages. And 2, it lets teams work in their own corner, in their own environment, their own bucket almost, or their own sandbox, to use your wording, Finn, without impacting other teams. So it's a great step towards collaboration. It's a great step towards multi-tenancy and towards project-driven policy authoring. The last new feature here on this slide, the 4th bullet, is unrelated to the first 3. The first 3 are more about the management, the processes, the authoring. The last feature is about integration. Some of the feedback we've been getting from developers in the last few years is that, okay, great, ABAC works for Java, ABAC works for .NET, but what about all those new languages, Python or JavaScript? What about mobile apps? What about single-page applications? How do you handle that? Well, now we've provided an API, we've provided a new authorization API that is still standards-based, but instead of using SOAP and XML, which are relatively heavy enterprise-focused standards, we use REST and JSON. And it means that with a couple lines of JavaScript, you can write a full-blown enforcement point. And that's just, wow, it makes integration so fast. So on that note, instead of just talking about it and killing our audience with PowerPoints, let's go have some fun and play with a live demo. As a bit of background, the use case here will be a banking use case where managers can view transactions, banking transactions, and I will add another role. So one of the neat things with ABAC is you can keep adding new roles. The second rule here is employees can view banking transactions in their own region. And finally, I'll add a more specific role, which is the owner of a transaction can view the amount for that transaction. So it's very, very specific. Now, if we look at one of those roles, the second one, employees can view transactions in their own region. We can look at the different building blocks or the different attributes we have here. First of all, user attributes, their role, employee, and their region. Action attributes, view. Resource attributes, the object type, the transaction. And finally, the region the transaction belongs to. So with that in mind, let's jump into the demo and see how we implement this. So let me go ahead and grab my policy editor. Okay, so here we have, let me go to the home screen. We have the Axiomatics Services Manager, which is the management portal for Axiomatics Policy Server version 6.0. Within the Axiomatics Services Manager, we can do everything from defining your attributes, defining your policies, defining the mapping between attributes and the underlying sources, defining your authorization domains, and eventually, of course, deploying the configuration to the different policy decision points. So let's focus on the policy management. Policy management is the new feature we have in version 6.0. And I'm going to step into my policy management. I'm presented with a screen where I can go ahead and create a new policy package. A policy package is a set of policies that you will deploy as a whole to an authorization domain. I've created a new package. I get a new package here, highlighted in blue. I can go ahead and give it a new name, and I'm going to call it my Acme demo. Now that I've done that, I can go ahead and open the package, and I'm going to expand my browser, and I'm going to minimize the demo package, and I'm going to focus on the Acme demo package, which is the one I just created together. I'm going to click on the policy. I'll rename it while I'm at it. I'll call it Global. And I'm going to minimize my browser and focus on the policy here.
So, David, I think it may be beneficial for the audience if you could enlarge your screen somewhat.
I think I have already. Is it big enough? If people cannot see my screen, shout, send us a question, we'll make it bigger, but it's already zoomed in quite a bit.
Okay, good. Sorry. Mm-hmm.
It's okay, Finn. You know, we know that you're at that age where, you know, you have to wear thick glasses in order to do the details. Please, if you're out there, please send us some funds so we can buy Finn a new pair of glasses. All right, so here, what I have on my screen is my policy. And we've chosen a convention where I have different graphical items. The first graphical item is in green here, as you can see on the screen. And the green is the policy set. And within my policy set, I can have different policies. So let me move that around a little. Inside, I have a policy. And inside of my policy, I have a role. So that's the basic structure that I want to have. In this case, we said we were dealing with banking transactions. So I'm going to go ahead and write banking transactions here. And then in my second item, I'm going to go ahead and write managers. And then in the last item, let me move it further along, I'm going to go ahead and say that managers can view transactions. As simple as that. And of course, since I said it was a positive rule, I'm going to hit that switch and make that rule a permit rule. So now if we look back at the canvas, we have a high-level overview of what the policy does. We have a policy set that focuses on banking transactions, inside of which we have a policy which focuses on managers, inside of which we have a rule that focuses on the ability to view the transactions. Now, in my scenario, I didn't just have managers, I also had employees. So I'm going to add a second policy here, click on it, and I'm going to add a description, employees. And if you remember, the employees, they could view transactions as well, but not just any transactions. They could only view the transactions they own. So I'm going to add a new rule, and in that rule, I'm going to say employees can view transactions in the same region. I'm sorry, I said they own a different scenario, transactions in the same region. Great. So now we have a skeleton of our policy fin, but in addition to the skeleton, we actually need to start using attributes.
You had one third case though, didn't you?
I do. We'll get to that later.
Okay.
So your eyesight is poor, but your memory is good. It's very reassuring, Finn. And mine is poor. So here at the very top level, I'm going to go ahead and add a target. A target in our language is the ability to constrain the scope of our policy, to define what the policy applies to. And here, since the description says banking transactions, I'm going to go ahead and add an attribute and call it banking transactions. So I have an attribute called resource type. Notice that it's defined within a namespace called com.acme, which is my namespace. And I'm going to choose the equality function, and I'm going to compare it to banking transaction. Simple as that. And now I have a policy that focuses on banking transactions. Great. What about my manager's policy? Well, I'm going to go here. I'm going to expand my panel. I'm going to add a target. And instead of focusing on the type of object, I'm going to choose the role attribute. Okay? And again, I'm going to choose the equal function, and I'm going to say manager. Now, if you want to see more in detail, I can always expand, make the screen a little bigger, and now you can see role is equal to manager. And remember that I said that it was about viewing. So either I do the action check in the role below, or I could also add the action here and say action ID is equal to string, to view. Simple as that. Now, we're done for the first branch because we're doing the transaction check in the parent policy. We're doing the role and action check in the manager's policy, and therefore the role is just a plain old role that says permit. It's an empty role. Now, in the employee's policy, we're going to add a role check. Here we're going to say com.role is equal to employee. And again, we have a simple check. And we can go one level below to go ahead and add a target, and the target will have the action. So I'm doing it slightly differently from the manager example, just to show you the flexibility. I'm going to say view. But we also said that we wanted to do a region check. So the region check we will do through the use of a condition, which is like, it's a target on steroids. It can do a lot more. So I'm going to click on add condition. And here I'm going to look for my region attributes. Okay, I've got 1, I've got 2, and then I'm going to compare these two attributes with the equal function.
So this is the region of the user compared to the region of the resource, namely the bank account or something like that, right?
Yes, in this case, the resource is a transaction. So we're looking at the, I called it TX,
yes,
the TX region, the transaction region. And of course, this is a permit role, if I remember correctly. So it will be allowed if the region of the user is equal to the region of the transaction of the resource.
The way the evaluation works is the policy, the authorization service will look into this policy. Mm-hmm. If it comes down and all these conditions are met, mm-hmm. then the effect permit will be returned, right?
Yes, yes. And one more item that I had in my use case was the ability to even control on the field level, on the item level, the amount of the transaction. Well, to do that, very simply, I could go ahead and add a policy here and say only owners of the transaction can view its amount. And then in the target here, I could define the resource type as the field of the transaction, or I could even call it transaction field. I could go ahead and add another attribute, resource ID, and compare that to amount. That is the name of the field, okay? And I'm going to minimize that. I'm going to insert a role. And in that role, I'm going to say deny access if the user is not the owner. So I'm doing it in a negative way because being the owner is not sufficient, but not being the owner is indeed sufficient to block the access. So I'm going to hit the switch, make that a deny rule. Note that here, the permit deny symbol has been updated to show a deny instead. And now I'm going to add a condition. And the condition will be something along the lines of owner, okay, equal, and I'm going to look for my subject ID, insert, so I inserted in the wrong location, let me change that. And of course, I need to have a not in front. And notice, by the way, the automatic validation, you could see that it blinked on and off with the error messages because the syntax was not correct. So you get automatic runtime validation of your syntax.
Cool thing there as well, then, is that you obviously say once, so if you take away the last parenthesis, it goes red, right?
Yes.
Now,
and it tells you what's wrong, by the way. If I scroll down, it'll tell you what the error is.
Right. And then you add the parenthesis. And this goes along with saving, right?
Yes.
So we never press save or submit or anything like that. It automatically saves into the database of policies.
Correct.
So, cool. Yeah.
And you get automatic version control as well on the policies. So if you wanted to roll back, you could do that.
And furthermore, then this also is an added aspect of the collaborative approach that we take, because we could have multiple users now working on the same policy, right?
Yeah. So let me give you a quick example of that. If I go ahead and here insert the parent policy and call that my global policy, okay? And below that, I still have my banking transactions, and I'm gonna hold it there for a minute, and I'm gonna go into my browser, and I'm gonna add another policy, and I'm gonna call that my security checks, okay? And in security checks, I'm gonna say global security checks. And in here, I'm going to do office hours as an example. And inside office hours, I'm going to say, quite simply, deny access before 9 a.m. I'm going to make that a deny rule. I'm going to add a target, maximize that, and I'm going to say current time. If the current time is less than 09:00:00, okay, then deny. I could also deny access if it was greater than 5 p.m. Actually, quite simply, do an or, and here, current time greater than 1700. Okay. And the one last bit about the collaboration thing, because that was the whole point. If I go back to my global policy, here, I can add a reference. Now, a reference is a neat feature which lets you connect to other policies and reuse those other policies. So now that I've written my security checks, I can go ahead and add in this panel here, if I maximize it, I can choose my destination node, and I'm going to choose the global security checks. Select, and we're done. Cool. On that note, Finn, I think it's time that we take questions.
Very good. Yes. So, yeah. First of all, thank you for listening, and please, let us have your questions.
So I'm opening up that question panel. We've got quite a few questions today. So one of the questions was around the performance of the system. So the performance of ABAC, that's been an ongoing fear, really, Finn. I mean, since we started working on ABAC, 9 years ago now, everyone has been asking, oh, is the performance bad? I mean, it's XML, isn't it? Well, no, I mean, first of all, no, it doesn't have to be XML. I mean, you store your policies in whatever format you want to store them. It is XACable. It doesn't mean that it's XML. And the performance, it's a matter of understanding what performance means to you. Are we talking millisecond, microsecond, second? It depends on the level you want to achieve. And I'm quite happy to say, Finn, that we've always managed to achieve the performance our customers needed, all the way from microsecond down to several milliseconds, depending on the type of application, if we're dealing with banking or hospitals or government. And it's a matter of scaling up correctly. One of the neat features of ABAC and of externalized authorization is that one of the design principles is that the authorization engine is stateless. So if you want more capacity, more performance, just add more authorization engines. Scale them up that way. Put a load balancer in front of them, and you get better performance.
Yeah, and I remember we've had situations in the past years where we've been pretty nervous about performance questions from customers in the early days. For instance, in the financial industries and trading applications where they count milliseconds in large amounts of dollars, and that sort of sounded difficult at first, and it has been. That never turned out to be the challenge. As we said earlier in this webinar, the challenge in all these projects were sort of non-technical nature.
Yeah.
Right? So performance was always something that you fairly easily could resolve. It was more difficult to do the other things. Yeah.
Another question that we've had pop up was around the REST profile. And yes, the REST interface that we mentioned in Axiomatics Policy Server 6.0 is indeed the REST profile of XACML that was written by a colleague of ours at the OASIS XACML Technical Committee. And I'm proud to say that we are the first in the world to implement both the REST profile and the JSON profile of XACML. Another question that just came in, how do you respond to the OAuth developer that says, why do I need Axiomatics when I can just use access grants with JOTs, with JSON Web Tokens? Well, they're not quite the same, really. You need both, I would say. You need OAuth and you need Axiomatics, but OAuth is about delegation of authorization. I am letting my Facebook tweet on my Twitter account. But XACML is about defining the global access control policies. So you would still have XACML policies on one side, on the Twitter side or on the Facebook side, that would determine who can do what with whose data within that scope. But the OAuth authorization and the JOT tokens are more about attributes that can be used in the XACML policy. There is, by the way, great research happening in the space of OAuth plus XACML, investigating how we can use OAuth scopes to carry XACML policies. Finn, I don't know if you heard about that research. That's a great way of carrying around XACML policies. Another question that just came in, now we're getting a lot of questions. I'll let you take that one, Finn, actually. How do you handle role conflict detection and resolution?
Rule conflict or role conflict?
Role conflict,
yes. So, and basically, we forgot to mention that when you showed the demo. In these little boxes, we had these little drop-down fields. Perhaps we should go back to that. Yes. So here you see PO means permit overrides, and these are the different standard algorithms that you can use to handle sort of how these different policies will play together. So yep. to a certain extent, one can say there are no conflicts in XACML because the conflicts are always handled. We always combine these things with an algorithm. So we say deny override or permit override or first applicable or what have you. So if I have 3 children, one can render permit, or they can all render permit or deny, and they're combined with a deny overrides. Then if one of the 3 or the 30 or whatever I have, if one single one says deny and all the other ones say permit, well, we'll have a deny, right? Correct. So we always control in the way we implement the policy how the conflicts will be resolved.
Yep. So the language itself automatically resolves conflicts. And then we have a pretty comprehensive set of testing tools to be able to test your policies to make sure that the way conflicts are resolved is the way you intended them to be resolved. Mm-hmm. So that's a great question that we get all the time. I wish I had $1 every time someone asks me that one. I'd be rich. Another question, Finn, that just came in, is there a way to build a resource hierarchy to reduce the amount of policies, i.e. when permitted to resource A, I implicitly have access to resources in the hierarchy of A? Shall I take that one, Finn? The answer is yes, there is, absolutely. And as a matter of fact, there's even a XACML profile to give you best practices on how to implement hierarchies of resources. In my example here, I do introduce a hierarchy of sorts between the transaction and the fields of the transaction. And if you look at it, I didn't define the other fields of my transaction. So if I have access to the transaction as a whole, I have access to all the children of the transaction, the social security number associated with it, the amount being the exception here, the date, the description. Now, I chose to define an exception with respect to the amount field. So here I was introducing the notion of a child of that transaction and being restrictive on that item. But the short answer is yes, absolutely. And it happens a lot of the times. It happens in Anytime you deal with a record, a medical record where you have different fields and potentially different subfields, an insurance record, same story, different fields, different subfields. And another one that's just come in, when I looked at the standard, it seemed like it was XACML XML inside the REST body. Does the JSON profile define an access control model that is JSON inside the body of the REST request instead of XML? Yeah, that's a very good point. So the REST profile of XACML is only about the transport itself, about posting a request and receiving a response, about getting the endpoint so that you know where the authorization engine is sitting. With the encoding of the request and the encoding of the response inside of the REST profile, that's defined either by the core spec, in which case you're dealing with XML, or by the JSON profile of XACML, which defines a JSON equivalent. And I believe I have an example somewhere here. Let me go ahead and go live a little. So here's a simple JSON PEP. And if I click, unlucky me, not working today. Let me see if I can find, I think I have another example here. Let's see. Not my lucky day. Let me grab it from my computer somewhere. Aha, I just found it. There we go. So this is a sample JSON PEP that I wrote for the Cloud Identity Summit conference last year, last summer, when we announced the JSON REST implementation in the Axiomatics product suite. This is what a XACML request looks like in JSON. It's much more, much denser, much more compact than an XML representation. And the interesting thing further is how we write this in JavaScript. So let me pull up my editor. And if we look at how the request is written, here is the code. Very simply, this is a bit of JavaScript. And it takes me less than 10 lines to create a XACML request. Very easy to use, very simple. Another question that's just come in is, what if I need grace periods, like change the region, but need access to records of my old region for a grace period? You can absolutely implement that. So you could have, there's different ways of doing that. You could have break the glass policies. You could have emergency policies that cater to that use case. You can introduce a time period as well in policy. So you could say you are allowed to access records of the region you are assigned in, or you can access records in a region you were previously assigned to for the next 30 days following the assignment. You could also have additional policies that say, if you're assigned to a record directly, so if you have a direct relationship with the record, you can access the record regardless of whether that record belongs to your region. As a matter of fact, to illustrate this, one of our customers in the insurance sector have the following policy. As a whole, claims processors can view claims in the region the processor is assigned to. In addition, claims processors can view the claims of those regions in an emergency mode. The idea is that if there's a flood in one part of the country, that particular part might not have enough employees to cope with the load of work. So then you can enable an emergency flag on the region, and everyone can get access to the claims from that region. So absolutely.
Cool. So, David, we're running overtime here.
I could go on forever.
Yes, I know. And it's so great to see all this interest. We're actually getting more questions.
There's one last one for the road?
Yes, okay.
All right. What criteria can you define queries to pip with? For example, I'm sure you can use the subject, but could you take a context attribute as well? For instance, for a doctor viewing a patient, could Axiomatics query a consent database, for instance, where the predicate is the patient ID? Absolutely. There's no limit to what the input to pip lookup is. So for instance, if you need to look up the role of a user, And the role, or let's take your example, you want to have the patient consent and you need the patient ID. You can definitely have a lookup that says select consent based on patient ID and based on the doctor ID. The way the PIPs are configured depends on the underlying technology of the PIP. So if it's an LDAP, you would write an LDAP filter. If it's a database, you would write a SQL select statement. And the select statement can be as complex or as simple as you like. There's no limit. To the extent that, as a matter of fact, if in order to look up an attribute in a PIP, you need another attribute in a separate PIP, you can do chained lookups as well. And that's automatically handled for you.
Very good, very good. So I think we're running out of questions, are we?
There is one more actually. What's your experience in count of policies and count of attribute? Millions or thousands? It's in the hundreds. It's in the hundreds. Attributes could potentially reach the thousands, but that would be very large deployments. But policies are always in the hundreds. It doesn't go beyond that. And that's because policies are extremely expressive. So you don't end up with the same problem as you do with role-based access control, where you have role explosion. Policies scale extremely well. And on that note, Finn.
Thank you everyone for listening. Thank you for spending more than an hour now of your lives with us. We enjoyed it. We hope to have you again in an upcoming webinar, not too far away in the future. I think the dates are a bit uncertain about on the webinars we have on our list here, but they're all upcoming in the next couple of months. So stay tuned. We have them published on our website. So looking forward to see you again. And if you happen to be at the Gartner Identity and Access Management Conference next week in London, then do not hesitate to bug my colleagues who will be there. Okay, thank you.